My son-in-law punched me. My own daughter dragged me out of the house by my hair. All of this, over $3 million I had worked my entire life to save. As I lay on the cold driveway, bruised and broken, I saw my neighbor's porch lights flicker on. Then came the sirens. Someone had called 911. But let me tell you something, police cars and flashing lights weren't the end of my story. They were only the beginning. Because that night, I made a vow. I would not just survive their cruelty, I would make them regret the day they ever raised a hand to me. My name is Eleanor, though most folks just call me Ellie. I'm 79 years old, with a bad hip, thinning gray hair, and a heart that has carried both joy and sorrow through the years. I thought I'd seen it all, burying my husband, raising my children, watching grandchildren take their first steps. But nothing in all my years prepared me for the betrayal that came from my own blood. My daughter, Claire, was always my pride. She was the child who painted me pictures in grade school, who held my hand at my husband's funeral, who swore she'd never abandon me. I used to tell people she had her father's soft heart and my determination. But over the years, something hardened in her. It started with her marriage. Claire married Michael 10 years ago, a man with sharp eyes, a loud laugh, and a temper he tried to disguise with charm. From the start, I didn't trust him. He had a way of making you feel small in conversation, of twisting your words into something ugly. But Claire insisted he was ambitious, that he'd give her the life she deserved. And maybe she believed it, because love can make you blind to red flags waving right in front of you. I tried to stay silent. I didn't want to lose my daughter. But silence only feeds the hungry. And Michael was a hungry man. After my husband passed, I managed our savings carefully. Robert and I had worked side by side for decades, me in the school library, him at the factory. We pinched pennies, skipped luxuries, and invested wisely. By the time I was in my 70s, we had over $3 million spread across investments, savings, and the house Robert had built with his own hands. That money wasn't just numbers in a bank account, it was our sweat, our sacrifice, our promise that our family would never struggle the way we once had. And Claire knew it. Michael knew it too. At first, their hints were subtle. "Mom, you don't really need all that space in the house, maybe you could sell it and move closer to us? Or you should put your finances in a trust, just so it's easier for us to help you later." Always with smiles. Always with that thin layer of concern that masked their true intentions. But my gut told me the truth. They didn't want to help me. They wanted control. One Sunday evening, I was invited over for dinner. Claire had made roast chicken, and Michael poured me a glass of wine, his grin a little too wide. Halfway through the meal, the conversation shifted. Michael leaned forward, his elbows on the table. "Ellie, let's be real. You're almost 80. Managing millions is a lot for someone your age. What if something happens to you suddenly? Shouldn't Claire and I be in charge now, so things don't get messy?" The bite of chicken turned to ash in my mouth. Claire didn't speak. She just stared at her plate, twisting her napkin. That silence told me everything. I set my fork down carefully, my hands trembling. "Michael," I said, my voice steady despite the storm inside me, "that money is mine. Robert and I built it. And I'll decide what happens to it. Not you." His smile vanished. He looked at Claire, then back at me. "You're being unreasonable." But unreasonable or not, my answer didn't change. I left their house that night with a pit in my stomach. Something inside me whispered that a line had been crossed. The weeks that followed were tense. They called more often, checking in not with love, but with questions about my health, about my finances. I caught Michael snooping through papers in my study one afternoon when he came by to fix the leaky sink. He had no shame, not even the decency to look embarrassed when I caught him. He just shrugged and said, "Just making sure you're keeping things in order." It all came to a head one evening. I had stopped by their house to bring a quilt I'd made for my granddaughter. The air was heavy when I walked in, the kind that tells you a storm is brewing. Michael was pacing the living room, and Claire stood by the fireplace, her arms crossed. "We need to settle this now," Michael said, his voice sharp. "Sign over power of attorney. It's what's best for everyone." I shook my head. No. That one word lit the fuse. Michael's face turned red, his fists clenching. Before I could take another step, his hand shot out. The blow landed across my cheek, the sound of it cracking through the room like a whip. I stumbled, the floor rushing up to meet me. Claire's voice cut through the ringing in my ears. "You've made this harder than it needed to be, Mom." And then, God help me, she grabbed a fistful of my hair and dragged me toward the front door like I was nothing more than garbage. My scalp burned, my body screaming with every pull, but the worst pain came from her words. From knowing my little girl, my Claire, had chosen money over her own mother. The front door flew open. She shoved me out, my knees scraping against the driveway. I remember looking up at the night sky, the stars blurring through tears. Then the voices of neighbors. Gasps. Shouts. Porch lights flickering on one by one. And then the sirens. Someone had called 911. As I sat there, bleeding, humiliated, something inside me shifted. This was more than betrayal. This was war. And I would not go quietly into the night. The police arrived in a blur of flashing red and blue. I remember the way the lights danced against the siding of Claire's house, casting shadows that made everything feel surreal. Officers swarmed the scene, their radios crackling, their hands resting on holstered weapons. One of them knelt beside me, his face tight with concern. "Ma'am, are you hurt?" I nodded, though my throat felt raw. My cheek throbbed where Michael's fist had landed, and my scalp burned from where Claire had dragged me. I could taste blood in my mouth, metallic and bitter. Michael stood on the porch, his arms crossed like a defiant child, while Claire hovered behind him, pale but silent. The officers spoke to them separately, then came back to me. I could see the hesitation in their eyes. Family disputes are messy. Unless there are broken bones or witnesses willing to testify, the law often treads lightly. Neighbors had gathered on their lawns, whispering, pointing. Some had phones raised, recording. I clutched that fact like a lifeline. Evidence. Proof that I hadn't imagined this. That I wasn't just some hysterical old woman crying wolf. The officers took statements, offered to take me to the hospital. I refused. Not because I wasn't hurt, but because I didn't want to be seen as weak. I stood slowly, painfully, and when Claire reached out as if to steady me, I stepped back. The look on her face, part shock, part shame, etched itself into my memory. "Don't touch me," I whispered. She let her hand fall. That night, a kind neighbor named Mrs. Thompson helped me back to my house. She pressed a bag of frozen peas against my cheek and kept clucking her tongue, muttering about ungrateful children. But I barely heard her. My mind was already racing ahead, past the pain, past the humiliation, straight into a place of cold, sharp clarity. I had a choice. I could let this night define me as a victim. Or I could use it as fuel. And at 79 years old, with nothing left to lose, I chose fuel. I didn't sleep. Instead, I sat at the kitchen table with a notebook and pen, just as I had the night my grandson stole from me years ago. Funny how betrayal has a way of circling back, like wolves that can smell weakness. But this time, I wasn't naive. I wasn't blindsided. I had been hit, dragged, humiliated, but I was still standing. On the first page of my notebook, I wrote a single line. 3 million reasons for revenge. The plan wouldn't be quick. It couldn't be. I had to be smarter than them, more patient, more ruthless. Because what I wanted wasn't just justice. I wanted to strip away their power, their pride, their illusion that they had won. I wanted them to choke on their greed. The first step was legal. I knew enough about the system to understand how inheritance, trusts, and power of attorney worked. Claire and Michael had wanted control over my finances. They assumed I hadn't thought ahead. They assumed wrong. Robert and I had been careful. Our investments were in my name alone, and my will was clear. But wills can be contested. Families can twist words. I needed to shore up every defense. The next morning, bruises blooming purple across my face, I called my lawyer, an old friend named Thomas Reed. He'd handled our estate planning years ago, and he still sent me a Christmas card every year. When he heard what had happened, his voice dropped to a low, dangerous growl. "Eleanor, come into my office today. We'll fix this." I spent the day with Thomas going over every document, every account, every asset. Together, we created a living trust that placed everything, every penny of that 3 million, into a structure that only I could control while alive. Upon my death, the assets would not go to Claire, not to Michael, but to charities I chose. Veterans' homes, children's hospitals, scholarships for kids who couldn't afford college. Not a dime would line the pockets of the people who had raised their hands against me. Thomas leaned back in his chair, satisfied. They won't be able to touch this, Eleanor. Not legally. But if you want to make sure they understand, you'll need more than paperwork. I smiled for the first time in days. Oh, I plan on it. The second step was proof. I needed more than my word against theirs. Yes, the neighbors had seen the aftermath, but people forget. Stories blur. I needed irrefutable evidence of their greed and violence. So I started watching, listening, recording. I bought a small voice recorder online, the kind that fits in your pocket. When I visited Claire, I tucked it into my sweater pocket, letting it capture Michael's angry tirades, his demands for my money, the way Claire's voice would tremble when she tried to placate him. I didn't confront them. I didn't argue. I just nodded, murmured, and let them believe I was softening. But behind closed doors, I played the recordings back, labeling each one with dates and times. Piece by piece, I was building a case. And then, opportunity came knocking in the unlikeliest form. One evening, Claire showed up at my house, her eyes red, her hair disheveled. She looked like the little girl I once knew, not the woman who had dragged me across concrete. "Mom," she whispered, "Michael's in trouble. He owes money. A lot of it. If we don't come up with something soon, things will get ugly." I should have slammed the door in her face. But I didn't. Because this was the crack in the armor I had been waiting for. I invited her in, made her tea, and listened as she poured out the truth. Michael had gambled away tens of thousands, borrowed from the wrong people, and now they were circling. She begged me for help, for money, for just a loan to get them through. I feigned hesitation, wringing my hands, glancing at the floor. "I don't know, Claire. That's a lot of money." She reached for my hand, her eyes desperate. "Please, Mom. We'll pay you back, I promise." I nodded slowly, masking the fire roaring inside me. "Let me think about it." When she left, I nearly laughed. They had no idea they had just handed me the final weapon I needed. Their desperation, their debt, their greed, it was all going to be their undoing. Because revenge isn't just about striking back. It's about timing. It's about letting the trap close when they least expect it. That night, I pulled out my notebook again and wrote a new line beneath the first. "Desperation is their weakness. Patience is my weapon." And for the first time since the night of the assault, I slept soundly. Because now, the game was truly mine to play. Desperation is a smell. You can sense it long before anyone admits it's there. When Claire came to me with tears in her eyes, begging for money to cover Michael's gambling debts, I knew she hadn't told me the whole truth. Desperation like that always runs deeper than people say. And I was determined to find out just how deep. I started small. I began asking gentle questions during her visits, the kind a mother might ask out of concern. "Are you safe, sweetheart? Do these people know where you live?" Each answer gave me another piece of the puzzle. I learned Michael had borrowed money not just from banks, but from dangerous men, people who didn't care about excuses, only repayment. They were circling their home, leaving notes, pounding on the door at night. And suddenly, I understood why Claire and Michael had been so determined to get their hands on my $3 million. It wasn't about securing their future, it was about saving their necks. The knowledge gave me a rush of power I hadn't felt in years. For so long, I'd been the one on the defensive, the one being stolen from, shoved, betrayed. Now the tables were turning, and I was the one holding the cards. But power, I reminded myself, had to be used carefully. Revenge isn't a hammer, it's a scalpel. Every move must be deliberate. So, I played the role they expected. I invited Claire over for tea more often, asked after the children, pretended to soften whenever she mentioned money. Michael too began showing up again, his fake charm dripping thicker than ever. "Ellie," he'd say, slapping me on the back as though he hadn't put his fist in my face weeks earlier, "we're family. We should be working together, not fighting." I smiled sweetly, keeping my bruises hidden under long sleeves. "Of course, Michael. Family should take care of each other." Inside, my stomach turned, but my mind sharpened. Because every smile, every fake laugh, every nod of agreement was another stitch in the web I was weaving around them. I knew I couldn't do this alone. I needed allies. So I reached out to Mrs. Thompson, my neighbor who'd helped me that night. Over tea in her cozy kitchen, I laid out the truth: Michael's violence, Claire's betrayal, the $3 million they wanted, and their growing debts. She gasped, covering her mouth with a trembling hand. "Eleanor, you can't face them alone." I smiled, a thin, tight smile. "I don't intend to. But I need witnesses. People who can vouch for what they've done. When the time comes, will you stand with me?" She nodded without hesitation. And soon I found others, neighbors who'd seen me shoved onto the driveway, who'd heard Michael yelling at me through thin walls, who'd noticed Claire's coldness. Quietly, I gathered them. Quietly, I built my army. Meanwhile, my little voice recorder filled up with hours of evidence. One evening, Michael exploded during dinner at my house, his voice booming as he accused me of being selfish for hoarding money while his family suffered. I didn't argue. I let him rant, let him spill every venomous word, while the device in my pocket captured it all. Another time, Claire muttered under her breath, "If you loved me, you'd help us. You're choosing strangers over your own daughter." That, too, was recorded. Every cruel word, every greedy demand, became a weapon in my arsenal. But I wasn't done. No, revenge required more than just defense, it required offense. I needed to turn their desperation into the very rope that would hang them. So, I dangled bait. One afternoon, as Claire sat at my kitchen table, wringing her hands, I sighed dramatically and said, maybe I could help with some of the debt. Not all of it, but some. If I liquidate a small account, maybe 50,000. But it would take time." Her eyes lit up, desperate hope flaring. "Mom, that would help so much. Michael would be so grateful." I smiled gently. "Just don't tell him yet. I don't want him to think I've changed my mind. This has to be between us, do you understand?" She nodded eagerly, like a child keeping a secret. "But of course," she told him. And within days, Michael came storming into my house, demanding to know when the money would be ready. I put on my best trembling act, lowering my eyes. "Michael, please," I said, "it would take time. The bank is very particular about large withdrawals." He sneered, pacing the room. "Time is what we don't have, old woman. If you cared about your daughter, you'd move faster." I murmured apologies, wringing my hands. Inside, I was smiling. Because now, I had him exactly where I wanted him, impatient, reckless, sloppy. The next step was setting the trap. I contacted Thomas, my lawyer, and explained what I needed. He raised an eyebrow but didn't argue. "Eleanor, you've always been shrewd. If you're sure this is the way." "I'm sure," I said. It's time they learned that the old woman they tried to break still has teeth. Together, we prepared documents, phony drafts that looked like preliminary transfers, statements that suggested I was preparing to release funds. They were worthless on their own, of course, but they looked convincing enough to someone desperate. And then I waited. It didn't take long. Claire arrived one evening, Michael in tow, his face pale and drawn. He slammed the papers down on the table, waving them in my face. "This isn't enough. Where's the rest? Where's the real money?" I feigned confusion. "Michael, I told you it takes time. I don't have access to all of it immediately. But if you're patient." He cut me off with a roar, slamming his fists on the table. "Patient? We're out of time. Do you understand what's at stake here?" Claire flinched at his outburst, her eyes darting to me as if pleading for me to give in. But I didn't. I sat there calm, almost serene. Because every word, every threat, was being captured by the tiny recorder hidden beneath the table. And then came the moment I'd been waiting for. Michael leaned in close, his face twisted with rage. "If you don't give us that money, Eleanor, I swear, what happened last time will look like nothing. You think a slap was bad? Try living long enough to regret saying no." The words hung in the air, poisonous and damning. Claire gasped, grabbing his arm, but it was too late. The recorder had caught it all. I sat back, my expression calm. "Michael, I'll think about it. Please just give me a little more time." He stormed out, dragging Claire with him. When the door shut behind them, I let out a long breath and pressed stop on the recorder. My hands shook, but not from fear. From triumph. Because now, I had everything I needed. Their threats. Their greed. Their desperation. The noose was tightening, and they didn't even know it. That night, I wrote the next line in my notebook. Let them dig their own grave. I'll be the one to hand them the shovel. And as I closed the book, I felt something I hadn't felt in years. Power. Pure, undeniable power. The kind of power only a betrayed woman with nothing left to lose could wield. The night after Michael threatened me, I lay in bed staring at the ceiling, listening to the clock tick on my nightstand. Each tick felt like a drumbeat marching me closer to the moment I'd been waiting for. I had the evidence. I had the witnesses. And now, I had the perfect weapon, their own words. But revenge, I reminded myself, isn't about one moment of satisfaction. It's about making sure the pain lingers, the lesson burns into their bones. So I didn't rush. I sharpened the blade slowly. My first step was quiet but crucial. I made copies of everything. Every recording, every document, every note in my little notebook. One set went into a safe deposit box at the bank. Another I gave to Thomas, my lawyer. A third I tucked into a sealed envelope and handed to Mrs. Thompson with strict instructions. If anything happens to me, if I suddenly fall downstairs or have an accident, you give this to the police. She squeezed my hand, her eyes fierce. Don't worry, Eleanor. They won't get away with this. That gave me peace. Because Michael was reckless, and desperate men do foolish things. I had to be prepared for anything. With my safety net secure, I began phase 2, exposure. It started small. I invited Claire and Michael to Sunday dinner. I cooked pot roast, just like I used to when Claire was a child. The table was set with my best china, the candles lit. To anyone else, it might have looked like a peace offering. To them, it probably felt like victory. Michael swaggered in, his arm draped around Claire, a smug grin plastered on his face. Finally came to your senses, huh, Ellie? I smiled sweetly, ladling potatoes onto his plate. Something like that. We ate, though I barely tasted a bite. My recorder was hidden under the table again, though at this point it was more for insurance than necessity. What I really wanted was to study them. To see the cracks forming under the pressure. And oh, did I see them. Michael drank heavily, his laugh too loud, his movements jittery. Claire kept glancing at me, her eyes full of something I couldn't quite name. Guilt? Fear? Or just hunger for the money she still thought she could pry from me. Halfway through the meal, I leaned back in my chair and sighed. I've been thinking. Maybe it's time I make some arrangements. After all, I won't be around forever. Michael nearly choked on his drink. Finally. So when do we get access? I tilted my head, feigning innocence. Oh, not yet. But soon. I've spoken with my lawyer. We're setting up new terms. Claire frowned. New terms. I smiled, letting the silence stretch. Yes. You'll both find out soon enough. It was delicious, watching the panic flicker in their eyes. Because nothing terrifies greedy people more than uncertainty. The next week, I moved to phase 3, public humiliation. I started with the church. I'd attended the same small Methodist church for 50 years, and everyone there knew me as gentle old Eleanor who baked pies for fundraisers and sang hymns with a shaky alto. On Sunday morning, I stood before the congregation, my cheek still faintly bruised, my voice trembling at first but growing stronger. I need to share something, I said. Something painful. I told them everything. How my son-in-law had struck me. How my daughter had dragged me out like trash. How they had demanded money, threatened me, tried to strip me of dignity. Gasps echoed through the pews. Some cried. Others shook their heads in disbelief. And then, I played the recording. Michael's voice, loud and cruel, filled the sanctuary. If you don't give us that money, Eleanor, what happened last time will look like nothing. The congregation erupted in outrage. People who had once greeted Michael with smiles, now muttered curses under their breath. Friends who had adored Claire looked at me with tears in their eyes and shook their heads. By the time I stepped down, the tide had turned. The story spread like wildfire through town. Small communities thrive on gossip, and this was hotter than anything in years. Everywhere Claire and Michael went, they felt the stares, heard the whispers. Invitations dried up. Friends pulled away. Even the parents at their children's school began to avoid them. But I wasn't done. I contacted Michael's employer, a small construction company, proud of its family values. I requested a meeting with the owner, a stern man named Mr. Patterson. I slid the recordings across his desk, my hands steady. This is the man representing your company in our community. Patterson's face darkened as he listened. When the recording ended, he exhaled sharply. Mrs. Walker, I'm so sorry. You can rest assured, this man won't be working for us any longer. And just like that, Michael's paycheck vanished. I thought that might be enough to rattle them, but fate gave me even more. A week later, I received a call from Thomas, my lawyer. Eleanor, you're not going to believe this. Michael tried to forge your signature on a withdrawal form. Sloppy job. The bank flagged it immediately. I closed my eyes, savoring the moment. Perfect. Absolutely perfect. Forgery. Fraud. Threats. Assault. I now had more than just recordings and witnesses. I had crimes. And with crimes came consequences. But still, I waited. Patience, I reminded myself. Let them stew. Let them feel the walls closing in. And stew they did. Claire came to me late one night, her eyes bloodshot, her hands trembling. Mom, please. Everyone's turned against us. Michael lost his job. We're drowning. Just help us. Please. Her voice cracked, and for a fleeting second, I saw my little girl again, the one who once clutched my hand when she was scared of thunderstorms. But then I remembered the searing pain in my scalp, the sound of her voice cold and cruel as she dragged me by my hair. I leaned forward, my eyes hard. No. Her mouth fell open. No, Claire. You chose him. You chose greed. And now you can live with it. She left in tears, and though my heart ached, my resolve did not waver. Because sometimes, the most loving thing you can do is let someone feel the full weight of their choices. By the end of that week, the sheriff's office came knocking. They wanted my recordings. My statements. My witnesses. It was time. I handed everything over, every last shred of evidence. And as I did, I felt lighter. The burden of secrecy lifted. The revenge I'd nurtured in silence was about to bloom in the open. The day they came to arrest Michael, half the neighborhood stood outside watching. He was led away in handcuffs, his face pale, his eyes darting like a cornered rat. Claire stood on the porch, screaming at the officers, screaming at me, screaming at the world. But I just stood there, calm, my chin lifted. Because justice wasn't a dream anymore, it was real, tangible, happening right before my eyes. That night, I wrote the final line in my notebook for the day. They tried to break me. Instead, I broke them. But even as I closed the book, I knew my work wasn't finished. Because revenge doesn't end with an arrest. No, the sweetest revenge comes when everything they clung to, money, reputation, family, crumbles to dust. And I intended to watch every piece of their empire fall. The morning after Michael's arrest, my phone rang before the sun was even up. It was Claire. Her voice cracked through the line, raw with panic. Mom, please. You have to help him. They're saying fraud, forgery, assault. He'll go to prison. Please, Mom, you can't let this happen. For a moment, I stayed silent, letting her desperation fill the space between us. Then I said, calm and steady, Claire, your husband made his choices. And so did you. I'm not lifting a finger. She sobbed, begging, pleading, swearing she hadn't meant to hurt me that night. But I remembered her hand tangled in my hair, the way she yanked me across the concrete like I was trash. My scalp still ached at the memory. I remembered her voice, cold and sharp, telling me I'd made things harder than they needed to be. So I told her the truth. I don't forgive you. Not for that night, not for choosing money over your own mother. I will not spend the last years of my life protecting people who tried to destroy me. Her sobs turned to curses. She spat venom into the receiver, blaming me for everything, Michael's job loss, their debts, their ruined reputation. I let her rant until the line went dead. And then I set the phone down and felt free. Because that was the final piece. When you no longer crave the approval of those who betrayed you, you become untouchable. But freedom wasn't enough. I wanted finality. So I moved to the last phase of my plan. The first strike was financial. Through Thomas, I updated my trust documents one final time. Every penny of my 3 million was secured beyond dispute, locked into ironclad trusts that bypassed Claire entirely. Not a dime would touch her greedy hands. Instead, my wealth would fund scholarships for young women in need, medical programs for veterans, and grants for single mothers struggling to survive. The causes I chose reflected the very values Claire and Michael had abandoned: compassion, responsibility, sacrifice. When the time came, I wanted them to know that the fortune they had salivated over had slipped through their fingers forever, transformed into something they could never reclaim. The second strike was public. The trial against Michael moved quickly. With the recordings, the neighbors' testimonies, and the bank's fraud report, the prosecution had a mountain of evidence. He tried to paint himself as a victim of stress, of circumstance, of my selfishness. But the jury didn't buy it. When the guilty verdict came down, Claire wailed in the courtroom, clinging to him as deputies led him away in cuffs. I sat in the back row, spine straight, eyes dry. And when Michael turned to glare at me, fury etched across his face, I met his gaze without flinching. He had punched me. He had threatened me. He had tried to steal my life's work. And now he would rot in a cell while I breathed free air. That was justice. But my revenge wasn't just against him. Claire needed to feel the weight of her betrayal too. And life, as it often does, provided the perfect hammer. Word of the trial spread far and wide. Her job as a school administrator evaporated under the weight of scandal. Parents refused to trust a woman tied to fraud and elder abuse. Her friends stopped answering her calls. Even her own children, too young to understand at first, began to sense the shame in her voice, the bitterness in her heart. She came to me once more, standing on my porch with hollow eyes, her hair unkempt, her clothes wrinkled. "Mom," she whispered, "please? I have nowhere to go. Can I stay here?" I looked at her, really looked at her, and saw not the little girl I once rocked to sleep, but a woman who had chosen cruelty over love, greed over loyalty. "No, Claire," I said softly but firmly. "You made your bed. Now you lie in it." Her face crumpled. She turned and walked away without another word. That was the last time I saw her. The weeks that followed were the sweetest of my life. I tended my garden, baked pies for the church, sat on my porch in the evenings watching the sun set over the trees. Neighbors stopped by often, not out of pity but out of admiration. They told me I was strong, that I had shown everyone what it meant to stand tall in the face of betrayal. And sometimes, late at night, I'd open my notebook and reread the lines I had written. 3 million reasons for revenge. Desperation is their weakness. Patience is my weapon. They tried to break me. Instead, I broke them. Those weren't just notes anymore. They were my testament. I didn't just survive what they did to me. I conquered it. I turned their cruelty into my strength, their greed into their downfall. And in doing so, I reclaimed something priceless, my dignity. One afternoon, Thomas stopped by with papers to sign. "Everything's in order, Eleanor. Your legacy is secure. Claire and Michael won't see a cent." I smiled, my heart light. "Good. That money will do more good in strangers' hands than it ever would have with them." He nodded, his expression full of respect. "You've done something remarkable." Remarkable. I let the words settle in my chest. For so long, I had felt like a victim, like an old woman tossed aside. But now, I was remarkable. I had risen from betrayal and carved justice with my own 2 hands. And that, I realized, was the ultimate revenge. Not just stripping them of money or reputation, but proving that I was unbreakable. That no matter how hard they tried to drag me down, I would rise higher than they could ever reach. The story of my revenge spread through the community, then beyond. People whispered it in grocery store aisles, shared it in church basements, even wrote about it in local papers. My name became a quiet legend, Eleanor Walker, the grandmother who brought down her abusers with nothing but patience, evidence, and the steel in her spine. And as I sit here now, years later, the sun warm on my face, I feel nothing but peace. My daughter and her husband are shadows of their former selves, their lives reduced to rubble by their own greed. My wealth has gone on to lift others higher, to give hope where once there was none. That's my legacy. Not the betrayal. Not the pain. But the revenge that turned me from victim to victor. So when people ask if I regret it, if I regret the years lost with my daughter, if I regret the family dinners that will never be, I say no. Because some bonds, once broken, cannot be mended. And some betrayals demand more than forgiveness. They demand justice. And justice, in the end, is exactly what I delivered.